to say that anybody who didn't get a reading list and would like one, there are a pile of them, is a pile of them here, which I'm going to leave on the table in case you would like to get one afterwards. They consist of books that I've used for this course in addition to others. Some of them are easily available and very readable. Others are perhaps not really what you might call nighttime reading, but you might find a few on there that were of interest to you. Thank you very much. I think we can probably begin now. And we're going on to lecture 2. This is a rather nice postcardy type picture of Yalta, one of probably the most scenic of the resorts on the Crimean coast, and quite a little port as well. If you remember, we ended yesterday with the Russian conquest, and the very last words I think I said, quoting Alan Fisher's History of the Tatars, was that although it was very nice for the Russians, it was generally seen as perfectly okay by Europe. It was an unmitigated disaster for the Tatars, the nearest thing to an indigenous people that Crimea had. And so we're going to carry on looking at that today and into the 19th and indeed the 20th centuries. So we're not covering the amount of time that we did yesterday, but we've got a good 175 years to go. And so I think we better get started. I thought I'd just start with a map to set Crimea a little more in context, perhaps. This is said to be about 1800, just before the Napoleonic Wars, and you'll see Crimea there. What a very small little place it is compared with the vastness even of the European side of the Russian Empire. And it was now, in fact, that the Russian Empire was expanding very rapidly eastwards over the Ural Mountains, across Siberia. In fact, Russian control already in the 18th century had virtually reached the Pacific in the north. And in the middle of the 19th century, the Russians would turn their attention to the independent Khanates of Central Asia, Turkic-speaking people like the Crimean Tatars, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all those areas as they now are, and include those. But this is the European side, and you'll see that Russia here is an awful lot bigger in Europe than it is today, because at that stage Poland had disappeared from the map, but that was a bit of Poland that Russia swallowed, and the rest was swallowed by the Germans and the Austrians, and here are all what are now the Baltic states. So we forget Finland as well. So it was a lot larger in Europe than it is today. So if we go back now and look at Crimea, Crimea was just incorporated with no special privileges or autonomy or anything like that into the Russian Empire. It got a Russian governor. You remember the last Khan of Crimea was sort of pensioned off. Eventually the Turks got hold of him and executed him, but for a while he lived quite a pleasant life in St. Petersburg. So it was simply the Tavrichevskaya, the Taurid, if you like, oblast or district of New Russia, this region of Russia, of southern Russia here, whoops, let's see if I can show you, known as New Russia. Well, that's the wrong one. There we are. Across here, all this area here, which was, if you like, Prince Pochomkin's own domain at this time. And it included some territory over on the sort of the side on the mainland as well. So it was Crimea plus this sort of area here around. This is the Sea of Azov, incidentally. That's going to be very important for what we talk about tomorrow. So it's a little inlet, very shallow, from the Black Sea. Catherine the Great was keen to remember that at this stage, Crimea was 98% Tatar in its population. And Catherine the Great, as you know, I'm sure, was what they call an enlightened despot. She certainly didn't believe in democracy or anything like that, but she didn't believe in harassing people about their religious faith. So she was perfectly happy to leave the Tatars to be Muslims, which they had been for many hundreds of years. And in fact, the hierarchy, the Islamic hierarchy, was left in possession of all their privileges, land-owning privileges, exempt from taxes privileges and others, and acted in a way as a sort of fourth column, whatever it is, to the Crimean people. So she rather wooed the Islamic priests and their seniors. The aristocracy, remember the Mirza, we talked about the Tatar nobles, were also sort of co-opted into the Russian nobility. They got Russian noble titles, and they also kept their estates, so they really had nothing to complain about either. The peasantry, most of the population, needless to say, were ordinary peasants. It was interesting, there'd never been serfdom in Crimea, but of course there had been in Russia, and still was. Serfdom was, the fate of more than half of the peasantry of Russia. They were owned by the landowners. And Russian landowners coming in to get presents that they're being given by Pushkin or by Catherine the Great, found that they had free peasantry to deal with a mind of their own. And when they said, well, let's make them into serfs, the government said, no, you can't do that. They've never been serfs. So that was a difference, and also, if you like, a saving grace for the Tatars. Serfdom did not come. Nevertheless, many of them left. This is actually the first of the major exoduses of Tatars from the Crimean Peninsula, which eventually reduced them to around about the 10 or 12% of the population they are today. Estimates vary terrifically. I'm so confused by the figures, I'm not going to give any of them, but what you can roughly say is that after each war between Russia and Turkey, and there were quite a few in the 19th century, a large number of Tatars who have been viewed by suspicion as possibly being traitors to the Russian cause left. And by the middle of the 19th century, by the 1850s, in fact, they only made up about half the population. So there'd been a big influx, and the government encouraged it, of mainly Slavic, Russian and Ukrainian people who came to live and work in Crimea, and the balance, the population balance, was already quite considerably changed by the middle of the century. How did the Russians see the Tatars? Well, not well. As Neil Acheson says in Black Sea, the Russians saw Tatars as a form of Turk whose first loyalty was always to the Ottoman Empire and to Islam. The government was always terrified that the Tatars would stage a revolt, but in fact they never did so. Tatar regiments, in fact, in the Russian army served with distinction in Russia's interests in both the Napoleonic Wars, and we're just before Napoleon starts his antics here in 1800, in the Crimean War of 1854 to 6, and in World War I too, and I'll come back to that later. Fischer, the historian of the Tatars, says that Russia had, as he puts it, utter disrespect for Tatar and Muslim culture, that they demolished structures of great value, and it is true they did, mosques, graveyards, civic buildings, all sorts of things, horrifying foreign visitors who wrote reports, English visitors and others, to the area in the early part of the 19th century. The palace at Bakhchisarai, of which you've already seen a picture and we'll be returning to it, survived only because Catherine the Great spent a night there when she went on that grand tour. You remember the progress that I talked about yesterday. And they actually installed a special bathtub for her, which apparently was quite a sort of tourist attraction in itself for a long time, although it is no longer there in the palace at Bakhchisarai. And Alexander I, Tsar to 1825, also did a few renovations, and people generally thought that that was quite well kept in the 19th century. I must say, when I've seen it in the second half of the 20th century, I thought it was very run down, but time has gone by. Now, of course, one of the main attractions always for Russia was the harbours and the coastline of the Black Sea, as you know. It was absolutely invaluable then, and as we well know, it is invaluable to today's Russia as well. A little fishing village called Akhtyar on the southwestern coast of Crimea, was given a new name, a very grand new name, which meant venerable city, Sevastopol, Sevastopol, as they pronounce it now. And many of you, I think, have either been there or certainly heard of that city. It was founded by the Russians in 1783. There are no buildings, so it's a huge building program. None of those buildings have survived, because whatever wasn't flattened in the siege of Sevastopol in the Crimean War was flattened, most for sure, in World War II. There were reproductions of a lot of these buildings that have been put up, but none of the original ones are there. The Black Sea Fleet, of which Pushkin was the Grand Admiral, though he wasn't a sailor particularly of note, was rapidly built with a lot of British naval advisors, including, I was intrigued to find, a chap called Samuel Bentham, who was a naval engineer, and who was the younger brother of the great Jeremy Bentham. Some of you may know of him as a philosopher of utilitarianism, whose mummified body, if ever you want to see it, can be found in University College London inside a cupboard, sitting in a chair, elegantly dressed. I've seen him. It used to be open most of the time, but it isn't anymore. Anyway, Samuel Bentham was a very well-known naval engineer, and he was over here in Crimea for quite a while. They built 24 ships of the line in double quick time. And a ship of the line has more than 40 guns. It's a big ship. It's not just a little cruiser or something like that. After that, if you added Russia's Baltic fleet, remember, the only other coastline that Russia had, apart from on the Arctic, was on the Baltic. If you added the Baltic and the Russian and the Crimean fleets together, the Black Sea fleets, the Russian Navy was almost as large as Spain's Navy, and not much smaller than France's. So it had suddenly become a naval power of note. The other point, just to mention briefly, I think, is that the economy, of course, had taken a terrific hit. It was basically agricultural, but there had been so much dislocation, so much disruption, not a lot of fighting, but it was badly damaged, no investment. And so Pushkin had a particular policy of turning it into what he called the orchard of the empire, and he introduced the wine industry. We'll be coming back to the wine industry a little later. He brought in 30,000 vines from Turkey in Hungary and planted them. That makes a sweet wine, as you probably know, quite a sweet, rich wine. And he planted vineyards on the coast near Sudak. He also leased land for vineyards to foreigners. There's a Frenchman, for instance, called Joseph Blanc, who came well before 1800 and was making wine, or he was growing grapes for wine and also for vodka on the Crimean coast. So the wine industry starts at this stage, and as I've already mentioned, settlers were encouraged to come into Crimea, which is quite an attractive sort of place to go. In fact, funnily enough, there was even a Swiss colony in Feodosia. A number of Swiss came and formed their own little community in Feodosia. If we turn now away from, the actual transition to a Russian possession to what Crimea was like in the first half of the 19th century, it became very rapidly a very attractive place for tourism. And this is particularly the case because we're in the era of romantic literature and art, when suddenly, from having been rather a nuisance, rugged landscapes and mountains and things like that were considered by 18th century poets, certainly in England, to be not worth talking about. They weren't interested in that. Suddenly mountains, torrents, crags, waterfalls, whatever it might be, are what poets liked. And so many poets and writers were amongst the people who came to have a look at Crimea for itself. Remembering, as I showed you on the map yesterday, that it was only really that southern and southwestern coast which was picturesque. When you get into central Crimea, it looks a bit like the Highveld, actually, only drier. It isn't very attractive. It's grassland. It's not very hilly. And then, of course, you've got the marshes in the north. Now, the great poet who came and made his name, oh, sorry, I should have shown you that. That was Sevastopol in the middle of the 19th century, just as distinct from the map that you see there. And here we have Pushkin. Now, Pushkin is the Shakespeare, without any doubt, of Russia, and a very, very fine poet. often very satirical poet, as well as being a great romantic, which he certainly was. And here is a painting of him. I don't suppose he certainly came to Crimea in 1820 with friends. He was in trouble with the Russian government at the time because he kept writing scurrilous verse about the Russian Tsars. And he was sort of not allowed to be in St. Petersburg. He was an aristocrat. He was educated at the noble officers' school in St. Petersburg, but he had to sort of be kept out on the fringes at this stage. And he visited Crimea after being in the Caucasus, which also, of course, appealed to him hugely. And here is a picture of him, supposedly lying on a rock and contemplating the view. Can you see him? He's not very clear. And Evazovsky, the artist, who is of Armenian origin, but was an Armenian Crimean, if you see what I mean. Here he is. That's Pushkin looking thoughtful and about to write, which he did, one of his great poems at Gorzów, which is a little bit up the coast from Yalta. And Evazovsky is quite an interesting, very, very impressionistic seascapey type of artist. He's certainly one of the artists of Crimea, and he came of an Armenian family. Remember, there were little Armenian and Greek minorities in all the towns. Pushkin was inspired to write several poems on his visit. He wrote a rather dappy thing, I think, about the sun setting over Gorzów, but he then wrote a wonderfully sinister poem called Talisman, which I like very much, and then he wrote a long narrative poem which is called The Fountain of Bakhchi-Sarai. Now, you will know that Bakhchi-Sarai is the palace of the Crimean Khans, and you will know that they had lots of slaves in their harem, and that the Crimean Tatars used to go and grab all the slaves from the Slavic world to the north. And he wrote a long narrative poem, completely fictitious. I mean, it wasn't about any historical figure, about a beautiful Russian girl she's a princess, who is stolen by the wicked Tatars and brought to the court of the Khan in Bakhchi-Sarai, where she pines away, and he's desperately in love with her and begs her for her favors, and she won't. And so he's turned off all his usual attractions, and his former chief mistress, in a fit of jealous rage, stabs the princess and is then herself hurled into a bottomless pit by eunuchs. You can imagine, it makes a very good poem. And the Soviets, in fact, made a ballet, which is sometimes performed. I think it was first performed in 1934, The Fountains of Bakhchi-Sarai. There's this little fountain here. There are a lot of fountains. It's a big Turkish thing. I think you probably know that. This is a little fountain in the courtyard at Bakhchi-Sarai. And when he went there, this, of course, is Pushkin. They're always keen to show how cultured everyone is and that Pushkin was there. And here he placed 2 roses for the poor princess in the upper basin of this fountain. And if you go and visit the palace, you will see, and I'm sure friends of mine and Alec will remember, there's always a rose in the fountain, or 2 roses in that fountain in memory of the Pushkin. So it was a big attractive place for tourists, not as much as it became later, because it was still, you had to get there by boat. It was quite cut off. But it was becoming an elite resort, slowly but surely, for the Russians. The imperial family, the Romanovs, acquired great estates there. They gave land to their favorite noble families. And here is the most extraordinary. I want to spend a little time on the palace of Lucca, which is on the coast between, well, it's sort of to the west of Yalta and definitely well east of Sevastopol. And Lucca was built in the early part, about 1820s, so quite early on, by a man who we called Count Mikhail Vorontsov, who at that stage was governor of New Russia. You remember Novaya Russia, that area in southern Russia, which Potemkin, who's dead by now, had ruled. And he was an interesting character, not only because he was cuckolded by Pushkin, as a great many people were along the line, but because his father had been Russian ambassador in Britain, and he'd actually grown up in Britain. And his mother was English, in fact, and his sister was married to the Earl of Pembroke, so he was very British. And he spent 22 years on building this estate, using, of course, his free serf labor from his Russian estates. But it never got finished in his time. And it's the most peculiar mix. Those of you who visit English stately homes may see some sort of similarity in the sort of Jacobean style here, vaguely. And it's in fact not unlike Wilton, which is the Earls of Pembroke's house. However, the back was a great Moorish mismatch. It looks like a great big sort of temple, goodness knows what. It had very contrasting patterns. Oh, Edward Blore, incidentally, who was one of the architects who built Buckingham Palace, which I don't think is a great recommendation, helped to draw up the plans for our Lucca. Our Lucca has a more, a sort of closer connection to Britain, in the sense that this is now on the seaward side, so the other side of the house from what we saw, and the sort of very fancy Moorish facade. And there's a staircase going down to the sea, and there are lions, couchant, all the way down the staircase. And when Churchill came to the Yalta Conference in February 1945, and we'll be talking about that again later, he was housed at our Lucca, which is actually very appropriate because, you know, the man who built it was very pro-British. And Churchill loved our Lucca. He thought it was a really nice place to be. And he really fell in love. You can't see in that picture so much, but some of the lions are fast asleep and look really sweet. And he asked Stalin if he could please take one of the lions back with him. He thought it would be such a good souvenir, but I'm afraid Stalin said, "Niet." So he never got them. I suppose it would have gone to Chartwell. It would have been a nice little thing to go and look at Churchill's house in Kent. So there's a bit of a British connection there. Now I want to move on a bit because time is not on our side. And I want again to put this in a little bit of wider context for you geographically. We're coming up to the Crimean War. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Crimean War. I think that Christopher Danziger did a very good course here a few years ago, which some of you may see. I'm not a military person particularly anyway, but both the causes and the effects of it are very relevant to what we're talking about. I want you just to note, first of all, let's see. I was holding this wrong way around. There we are. Black Sea, there we are, Sevastopol, Yalta, Kerch, and the narrow straits going to the Sea of Azov. And most particularly, that if the Russians want to be a big power, they've got to get in their navy into the Mediterranean. It's no good having your navy bottled up in the Black Sea. What use is it there? Okay, you might manage to fight the Turks in it, but that's about all. So they want very much to get, here's the Bosphorus, and here is the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, which is also a strait. And to get there, they're going to have to try and weaken Turkey, either weaken Turkey and force it to agree that Russian warships can go through the straits, or conquer it and take over altogether, which, of course, you remember is what Catherine the Great wanted. She wanted to have, restore the Byzantine Empire with a Russian emperor on the throne. In Constantinople, and that didn't happen. And this is really the germ of the Crimean War, that throughout this century, the Russians call it the Eastern Question, Vostochny Vopros, and it's, it really is a sort of theme tune of international relations, certainly for Russia, and in a way for Western Europe too, because Western Europe did not want Russia to have its big fleet out in the Mediterranean. Remember, the Suez Canal was being built was going to be built shortly. The Eastern Mediterranean had to be a British, and if they really had to, a French area, not the Russians. So we get the British and the French shoring up the sick man of Europe, as Turkey was increasingly known, because it was radically weakening. If you want to read more, Orlando Fargis's book on Crimea is a very, very good read about the Crimean War. At the beginning of the war, 1854, these straits, the straits through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, were closed to warships. In other words, the Russians couldn't get their navy out. They could get their merchant vessels out, but not their navy, or in for that matter. And so they actually invaded territory, Polish territory, and fought a war against the Turks, which actually ended without, up in this point, this was at that stage, this is modern map, but in this area was still part of the Turkish Empire, and up here, they fought a war for about a year without too much effect, And as soon as the Turks were attacked, the British and French came in to support them. And after a year, the Russians withdrew, and the British and French decided they were going to follow them. And they decided to follow them to Crimea and fight it out in Crimea. And that's what the Crimean War is all about. Now, as I've said, I'm not going to talk about the war itself. What I want to recommend to you, apart from Orlando Figes' book, though, is 3 wonderful short stories, well, they're fairly short stories, by none other than Tolstoy. And they were actually he was an officer in the Russian army throughout this war and in Sevastopol. So he sometimes outside it, sometimes inside it. And he writes, the book is called Sevastopol Sketches normally in translation. And he wrote 3 sketches. One is called Sevastopol in December, and then one in May, with December 84 and May 85, and the last one is Sevastopol in August, because Sevastopol was besieged by the British and French. The Russians sunk their fleet in the harbour so that they couldn't land troops, but they came from the land side, the British and French, and besieged Sevastopol. It's a wonderful read. It's short, and it's really well worth a read. This war, although the Russians lost it in the end, as I'm sure you're aware, has a very sacred place in Russian history, and certainly you hear Mr. Putin talking about it quite a lot. It was a defeat, but a noble defeat. Now, if you go, has anyone been to the panorama in Sevastopol? Why, right, a few of you had. It's an amazing little round building, and inside is enormous. You walk around like this, and at the back, there are models, and in the front they are, at the front there are models, and at the back it's just backdrop. This was actually just at the end. You were supposed to be standing on the Malakoff Bastion, which was one of the fortifications in Sevastopol, which the Russians held right up to August 1855 when they had to give in. And it's very, very effective. It gives you quite a feel of what that war must have been like. But I do recommend Tolstoy, and he says himself that he actually, his experiences there made it much easier for him to write the battle scenes in War and Peace, which he wrote about 10 years later. Now, so for Russians, as somebody says, this war and its defeat has a semi-sacred place in Russia's collective memory. It was a glorious defeat. It's been turned into a patriotic myth. It's quite extraordinary. We'll come back to this, but I'm just saying that Russians don't see it as a humiliating defeat. They see it as a noble defeat, a necessary and noble defeat, which was imposed upon them entirely unfairly, I need hardly say, by the outside world. The impact of the war was considerable, however, on Crimea. First of all, as I said already, the Tatars, who had not gone over wholesale to the Allies, although some of them did work for the Allies, who were in Sevastopol and outside it. But most of them did not. There was no evidence of mass Tatar collusion whatsoever with the Allied forces. But Alexander II, the new young Tsar, his father died at the end of the war, decided that the Tatars were unreliable and must be watched. And there was a lot of anti-Tatar feeling, and so we don't know quite how many. I get, as I've said, different numbers. I can't believe it. If the numbers all add up, there are more Tatars who left than there ever existed, so I won't give you numbers, but it was a large number. Somebody here says about 200,000. I think that's too much, but a lot went. They tended to go to Turkey, obviously. That was where they would feel at home. There was more immigration as the Tatars left, so more people came in, mainly from Russia and from the Balkan states, Serbs, other Slavic people from the Balkans. The peace treaty at the end of the war really made the Russians fed up. The Peace of Paris, 1856, declared that the Black Sea was open for commercial shipping, but neutral and off-limits for warships. So the Russians couldn't even sail their navy on the Black Sea. And it was really very, very irritating indeed for them. And they did not stand for it for very long, as you will see. They also, I think, the sort of terrific chip on the shoulder, which is definitely a sort of feature of how Russians look at the West, the chip got deeper in this war, without any doubt. And the feeling about foreigners became less and less warm, apart from, as I've said, the feeling against the Tatars. More positively, Alexander II, looking at the fact that the Russian army had been hopelessly inefficient, which it really had, and was just organized so incredibly badly, and also that most of the soldiers, not the officers obviously, but the soldiers were serf conscripts, and who did not fight well, and it did not make a good fighting force. Serf conscripts did two things. First of all, he abolished serfdom. So only in 1861 was serfdom abolished in Russia. Slavery, it's the slavery, it's just the same as slavery, which is quite extraordinary. He said, it's better to abolish serfdom from above than to have it abolish itself from below. Very perceptive, I think. There were also then brought in reforms to the whole way the Russian army was structured and organized. Not, I might tell you, that when we come to World War I, they seem to have improved it an awful lot, but that's another story. Only 14 years later, Prussia and France were involved in a nice fat war over near Paris, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, which the Prussians won. And while all that was going on, the Russians said, right, they unilaterally denounced, as it's put in such terminology, the Black Sea clauses of the Paris Treaty. And in fact, at the end of the war, there was a conference in London, and they confirmed that all warships might go on the Black Sea. So if you want to have a really nice big naval battle, and you're in the Mediterranean, you just have to say, sorry, Turks, we're coming through, and go into the Black Sea, and you can have a battle. Or vice versa, you can come out of the Black Sea and have a battle in the Mediterranean. So they got what they wanted after a relatively short time. In fact, after 1870, therefore, of course, the Russians enlarged their naval bases, particularly Sevastopol, considerably further. Now we're going to come to Russia's Crimea's really golden age, which was the sort of period from after the Crimean War up to World War I. There could be no real sort of mass tourism until a railway could be put through, and a railway was put through to Sevastopol, completed in 1875. So people could now come by train instead of having to go by boat, which was obviously slow and difficult. This was a period, in fact, when the Russians were doing a great deal of infrastructural development. The Industrial Revolution came very slowly and after it did to Western Europe, but it was coming to Russia and it was necessary, and railway building, as you know, is always a big feature of any industrial revolution. And it said, you may remember that in 1867, the Russians sold Alaska to the Americans. Right, and I read it in a couple of books, so I thought it was worth saying, that they think that that money was partly, at any rate, used to build railways. The Russians were short of cash, to do all this infrastructure, and selling off what they thought was a pretty useless bit of land was the way to do it. Alexander III had, you saw Yalta at the beginning, had the harbour improved, and it's really very interesting that by the 1880s, Yalta had it had reticulated water supplies, so you would open a tap and water would come out of the pipe. It had waterborne sewage even, and this is all apparently due to the sort of way that the harbours were constructed. I expect it all went straight out into the sea. In those days, nobody minded about that. And by 1900, as one writer puts it, Yalta was the summer capital of the empire. The Russian elite, as the very good, in fact, I would recommend that, it's on your list, Serhiy Plokhy, who is a Ukrainian historian. He's professor of East European history at Harvard, so he's no sort of propagandist. It's a very good book. He says the Russian elite made the Crimea part of its expansive imperial home. It was highly fashionable. People like to compare it to Nice. I don't really think it's like Nice, but still. The Romanovs started building palaces. The first one was at Oreanda, near Yalta, which actually burnt down, but they were back. They never actually lived in that one anyway. And the second one was actually Alexander III, who was Tsar from 1881 to 1894, bought the Massandra Palace from, in fact, it was one of Vorontsov's sons, I think, so, you know, the English count's sons. And as you can see, it's built in rather sort of French late empire style, isn't it? It's quite a funny-looking building. It's now a museum, of course. In fact, he never lived in it, Alexander III. And the most important thing about it is that he built wine cellars in the hills behind, in this soft limestone. There are many, many caves, and the easiest thing in the world was to burrow into those caves and make wonderful, wonderful wine cellars. And in those cellars are wines dating back, actually, the oldest ones are actually sherry, which makes sense, to Count Mikhail Vorontsov's days. The oldest bottle, I think, in there, just look how the cobwebs are, is from 1775 or something like that. So, I mean, a lot of it's probably not drinkable, but it goes for miles. I mean, there are perfectly commercial wines in there as well, and you can go and do a wine cellar tour, which we've done. Anyway, no Romanov ever stayed in Massandra either, funnily enough. Stalin loved it. He said it was his Crimean dacha, as he put it. If he came to the Crimea, that's where he liked to stay. It's a museum now, as I've said. And when the Russians came back to Crimea in 2014, one of the things that they were noted, you could see, I mean, I haven't been back since, but they put a lot of statues around, Russian statues that link it up with Russian history. And there's a big bust of Alexander III, apparently, who was a very strong man, Tsar, and the sort of Tsar that Mr. Putin would very much approve of, in the hall at Massandra. Now, I think while we're on imperial palaces, let's do the most important one, the one that you know all about already, Livadia. The Livadia Palace, which comes from the Greek word meaning meadow. People use a lot of Greek words because somehow the Russians like the idea that the Greeks, as you know, were there 2 millennia earlier. The Livadia Palace was the favourite place, really, of the last Romanov family, Nicholas II and his family, and where they always came and had their holidays. It's now a museum as well. They've brought in a great deal of sort of Romanov stuff so that you can sort of see how the family lived, where the children had their schoolroom and all that sort of thing. It's a great big, enormous, great big white building, open to the public now. As you know, the Yalta Conference took place in the palace. We'll come back to that in 1945. And the Germans, when they took Crimea in 1942, also held a big celebration party in the gardens here. So that's Livadia. On a slightly different scale, but almost more eccentric, is the Swallow's Nest. That was built by a German, Baltic German, so a Russian subject, baron, who'd made a huge amount of money out of oil. Oil is suddenly becoming important in the world economy. We're talking 1910, and he'd invested early in the oil wells in Baku, in what's now Azerbaijan, made a lot of money, pile of money, and built this extraordinary little, it's really a villa, it's small. There's a little restaurant in it now, but it's cantilevered out over the sea with an enormous drop. It's quite an amazing place to go to. And it's called the Swallow's Nest for obvious reasons, because it's sort of high up and sort of perched over the sea. Now I'm going to turn away from the nobility to much nicer people in my view, which are the artists and the writers and the ordinary people who came and had their holidays in Crimea. The ordinary folk, the middle classes, I'm not talking the poor, loved coming to Crimea as a holiday destination. Even in those days, there were sanatoria where people who weren't well could go and stay and take a cure. If you had tuberculosis, which tragically so many people did, it was a very healthy climate to come to. And of course, it didn't have the cold winters of the rest of Russia. It had snow sometimes, but very, very rarely. In the Crimea, more than anywhere else, I think you could see what Rosamund Bartlett's, and I recommend her book on Chekhov in the list there, called The Rich Blossoming Russia of Russian Culture at the Turn of the Century, as if knowing a blight would follow, she says. And Anton Chekhov, who is one of my absolute favorite Russian writers, when his tuberculosis got really too bad, which it did, and he was a medical doctor, so he knew that his end was near, he came and he built just outside Yalta on the hills, he built what is always called the White Dacha. There it is, in a lovely garden. He loved his garden. He planted lots of fruit trees, and there his friends would come and visit him, and he would go and visit his friends who were living or staying along the coast as well. His most famous short story, and the one I will recommend if you don't know it, is called The Lady with the Lapdog. And that is set in Yalta. And I've just reread it for the umpteenth time, and it strikes me as so extraordinary because he takes a really banal case of adultery and he turns it into a wonderfully pathetic and moving story. And so if you don't know it, have a read of The Lady with the Little Dog or Lapdog. And he, although he knew he had to live there, he didn't like it. He called it his warm Siberia, because he knew that he used to go up to Moscow in the summer, and he was married to an actress. He just married to an actress at the Moscow Art Theatre, and she went on and had her career all the time in Moscow, but he couldn't come. He was really bored and lonely, he said, in his warm Siberia. He didn't think that Yalta looked at all like Nice, and he says the women smelt of ice cream. So he was not keen on it at all. Two visitors to the White Dacha. I think one you will recognize, the gentleman on the right in the right-hand picture, the bearded oak, Tolstoy. Leonid Tolstoy, there he is. And over here is Chekhov with Maxim Gorky, two very different generations of Russian, and in the case of Gorky, also Soviet writers. Both of them were in the Crimea on holidays. Tolstoy was quite old by then, and part of his health too. And they were all good friends. But poor old Chekhov, as you know, wrote wonderful short stories, and he also wrote famous plays, most of which have been, you will know, like The Three Sisters, Seagull, and so on. And Tolstoy absolutely hated Chekhov's plays. He liked the stories, but he said, Shakespeare's plays are bad, but yours are even worse. so poor Chekhov was a bit sort of dismayed by that, I think. Artists came to see him. Musicians, Rachmaninoff played the piano, visited and played the piano in the White Dacha. And one of the artists who, I've just put that there for a curious little story, which I mustn't waste time on, but this is an artist called Archip Quinci, Greek origin, Crimean, who painted a lot of really rather fascinating pictures using light in a very special way. And that is a painting he did of Mount Ai Petri, which is the highest mountain in Crimea. It was hanging at an exhibition 2 years ago, well, about 18 months ago, in the Chekhov gallery in Moscow, and together with other pictures by Quinci. And so, people who were there saw a man come and look at it, pick it up off the wall, put it under his arm and walk out. And they thought, oh, he's obviously just someone from the gallery. You know, there's something has done it. Well, he walked straight out and stole it. It was the most extraordinary thing, and he was caught on the cameras, of course, as he did this. And they got it back within 48 hours. It was never quite clear what he wanted it for, but he was just completely brazen. Anyway, that's just a funny little story. The Tatars also at this stage, those who were still there, actually were not too badly treated, and they had a very remarkable man as their leader and chairman of their council, called Ismail Gasparali, who really encouraged Tatar education and modernizing Tatars so that they could play a role of a sort of modern nation within Russia, which was such a multinational country with all the imperial possessions that it now had by 1900 or so. And needless to say, some of the people who acquired a much better education, thanks to him, than had ever been possible before for Tatars in Crimea, became quite politicized. And then I think we'll move on a bit because we have to look at the war and the revolution. I just want to say that I mentioned that the Tatar forces played an honorable role in the Russian army in World War I. They would normally, most of the Russian activity, of course, was in what's called the Eastern Front here. But they were sent to the Western Front. Can you guess why? Turkey was on the side of the Central Powers. Turkey was an enemy, right? In this, it was allied to Germany and Austria. They thought if they had the Tatar forces and their armies here, they'd probably go over to the Turks. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So they sent them, they said to the British and French, hang on, we'll send you some really good men to the Western Front. So again, there was never any evidence that they were going to do anything like that, but that's what happened. Of course, in 1917, as we all know, the revolution happened, and that led to a very, very difficult time indeed for Crimea and for the Tatars, I think, in particular. It was incredibly complicated, and I'm not going to go into detail. You will know that there was one revolution in February 17, which caused the Tsar to abdicate, and a sort of nascent democracy under a provisional government until elections could be held. But the war was going on. It wasn't possible to hold elections. They couldn't hang on to power. The Bolsheviks took over in October 1917. And then the Civil War erupted. And it was fought all over Russia and Siberia. But in the south of Russia, where Crimea is, the main white forces were commanded by a man called Anton Denikin. They included many Cossacks. Remember the Cossacks? Very military people who joined in fighting for the Tsar. Crimea, just this little Crimea that we're looking at, had 7 changes of government, virtually all of them violent, between 1917 and 1920. So it was, I'm not going to go into the details, but the Bolsheviks came and went 3 times. In other words, they arrived and then were kicked out. And on one of the occasions, Lenin's brother, Dmitry Ulyanov, was actually put in charge. The Whites, Denikin and then General Wrangel, were in power twice. They managed to run their own affairs twice for a little while. The Crimean Tatars, sometimes in alliance with the Bolshevik sailors in Sevastopol and sometimes not, ruled their own affairs for a little while until somebody else came in. And the German government in Kiev, in Ukraine, where the Germans were controlling there, also allowed them to do that. But it was all very short. And by 1920, the Bolsheviks finally came back, November 1920. Before the Bolsheviks finally came out, and just before, just as a sort of little side note, here are the passengers on some of the last boats out of Yalta in 1919. There you see the Empress Maria Fyodorovna, Nicholas II's mother, and his uncle, the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, who was about 6'7", a very tall character. And also on the boat were some Tatars, but very special Tatars, Felix Yusupov and his wife, who was Princess Irina of Russia, Nicholas II's niece. And they, of course, were richer than the Romanovs. And the fortune came from the Yusupov, who were Nogai Tatars, which were Tatars like the Crimean Tatars, but just on the mainland, and they'd built up their wealth over centuries and were hugely, hugely wealthy. Anyway, they also got out on the same boat, and the memoirs of the captain of the ship are really extremely readable. You can get them on Google. Anyway, there in 1920, 8th of November to be precise, the Red Army arrived for the 3rd time, and this time it stayed, and Soviet Crimea started. I want just to say just a very few words about this. The Crimeans thought they might be better off under the Bolsheviks than they'd been under the Tsars. But initially it really seemed so, because under the Tsarist rule, they were allowed to have their own schools, they were allowed to have their own cultural affairs, they were promoted to various levels of government in the Crimea. Their language was an official language, and they were reasonably sort of comfortable. And this was a sort of short golden age for the Tatars, but it didn't last, because in 1928, Stalin, who came to power in 1927, started to suppress all what he felt were nationalist movements. Nationalism was seen as bourgeois and unreliable, and the poor old Tatars, really, their leaders were executed. They were forced into collective farms, as you know. 2 dreadful famines, one of which was the Great Famine, which killed so many millions of people in Ukraine in the early 30s, affected Crimea too. And so by the end of the 1930s, Crimea was in a very bad way indeed. Looking at World War II, I think it's the last thing I must do, and do it quickly too. In World War II, as you know, the Germans invaded in 1941. And like the people of Ukraine, when the Germans got down to Crimea, most Crimean Tatars, at any rate, were only too happy to welcome the Germans, who they thought might make life better for them. The Germans came down. They actually conquered most of Crimea in a very few months. By November 1941, Crimea was basically under German control, except for, I forgot that. This is such a lovely piece of Soviet, isn't it? There you are, banner of friendship of the Soviet peoples, and of course it wasn't anything of the sort. There we are. There we are. The siege of Sevastopol, the German siege of Sevastopol, which left it virtually not a stone standing on another, went on until July of 1942. It was a very bravely fought fight on the part of the Russians, and Sevastopol is one of the 12 hero cities of the Soviet Union for its resistance, its strong resistance. The Germans took over, as you know. The SS was very active. They massacred a lot of Crimean Jews and gypsies. They were slightly less they thought that the Tatars were intermentioned, but they didn't actually massacre them or anything. But their aim is it's quite interesting to think back. Their aim for Crimea was that it would become a completely German colony of Gotland. Remember the Goths? And that whole bit I told you, in the Middle Ages, there was still some German words being spoken in the language of the people living in the interior, what had been the Gothic principality in the Dark Ages. Well, the Germans really took to this. Their sort of race theorists really took to it. They decided that this would be a wonderful place to have a sort of mini Germany. And they were going to bring in Germans, and only Germans, long term. That was their aim for Crimea. But of course, it didn't happen. Now, many people, Tatars and others, cooperated with the Germans. It was a bit scary if you didn't. Some of them even joined their self-defense battalions. But many others went out to be partisans and to try and fight a sort of guerrilla war against the German occupants. And in so doing, the Tatars had to form their own, because the Soviet partisans, the Reds, wouldn't have Tatars in their forces at all. Nevertheless, and this is the tragedy of it, in 1944, the Red Army returned. The Germans are now very much on the retreat, back across the great swathes of European Russia, pursued by the Red Army. And a total reign of terror ensued. Many, many Tatars were executed as collaborators with little or no evidence. And on the 18th of March 1944, 183,155 Crimean Tatars were shoved into boxcars on the railway line and sent off to Central Asia. The entire Tatar population of Crimea was sent to Crimea. But of course, sent to Central Asia, mainly to Uzbekistan. Now, on the journeys, something like 46% of them died. The Soviet record says rather less. The facilities were absolutely inadequate. And returning Tatars who've been fighting in the Red Army, including some who become heroes of the Soviet Union, and one pilot, Tatar pilot, who had been twice given the Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union. As soon as they came home, they were given the same treatment. Nobody of Tatar origin was left in Crimea. And what was the deportation for? It was supposed to be treachery in World War II. They actually also shipped off other groups as well, the Chechens, for instance, in the Caucasus as well. And the Crimea was just made an ordinary district of the Soviet Union, of the Russian Federation, in fact, of the Soviet Union. And at that point, all what was left of Tatar cultural monuments were destroyed. Not, of course, actually, funny enough, some of the mosques and also the palace at Bakhchisarai, but there was a great deal of